Today, I'll show you how to create this render of these castle towers. My goal is obviously to teach you how to model a specific scene, but I also want to give you the techniques you need to create anything you want. I don't like watching videos where you don't learn anything and end up with something you don't even understand, so that's why I'm making this one. So get ready for the journey and let's get into it. As always, the first part of the video is more important than anything else will do. From my experience, it's the difference between something that looks real and something that looks fake. And like I've said in my other videos, it's actually really easy, but maybe not the most glamorous. Gathering reference. Making this project has been quite a journey for me, as you can see by how much random stuff there is here. This software, PRF, is free and I'll link it in the description. But I actually started out with this scene from the Game of Thrones books, and because I didn't gather enough reference, my render looked like this. So I decided to change gears a little bit and make this video's renders, but with a lot more reference than before. The most important thing I can say here is don't overlook this step. But now it's time for Blender. First we need to make the terrain, which will set the stage for everything else. And the way we do this is actually really satisfying and pretty simple. First we're going to make a shit ton of cubes, and you'll see why soon. Once you have something that looks like this, add a plane and scale and shape it for a floor. But now we're ready for the fun part. Go to the modifiers tab and add a remesh modifier. Adjust it to a point where the geometry has enough faces to sculpt with, but not so many that your computer explodes. Now for the fun part, sculpting. Head over to the sculpting tab and use this clay strips brush. Here, keep in mind how the terrain was formed. These rocks were probably eroded by a river a long time ago, judging by how straight the gulch is. That's also why they're relatively smooth compared to those in the background. There are also a lot of flat surfaces where moss and grass grow. Sculpt with what you thought of. And this doesn't just apply to terrain, it really just applies to anything, even if you're not sculpting. And once you're done with the sculpt, it's time to make it look like rock and bring it to life. And to do that, we need to add the material. Afterwards it should look like this, so obviously we'll do more later, but adding the first material to a scene is always fun. First, change your render engine to cycles and GPU to GPU compute, and go to polyhaven.com and download an HDRI that you think would look good in your scene, which gives it a background. Next, go back to Blender and navigate to this tab and find your .exr file like this. Head to the Shading tab and add a new material and enable the Node Wrangler add-on. Now go to the right and hit Add Principled Setup. To download your textures, go to somewhere like Polyhaven or AmbientCG.com, where everything is free. Make sure you download the albedo, which is the base color, the roughness and the normal maps at least, and remember where they go in your computer. Since I don't have time here, if you want to know what they do, watch my video on photorealism after this. But once you have them, hit Add Principled Setup and find and select your images. And just like magic, something should happen to your mesh. If it turns gray or just one color, that means your UVs are wrong. Basically, Blender unwraps your object's faces kind of like a cardboard box or a present, stamps an image onto them, in this case the rock, and wraps them up again. To change how Blender unwraps your object, go into Edit mode and select every face with A. Hit U and then Smart UV Projection. Now it should be fixed. If you want to make it smaller, turn up the scale of the X and Y under this mapping node. For now, don't worry, we'll start on the tower soon, but first we need to make what we have now into its final result. I noticed it was looking a little bland on its own, so I settled on a fix that would actually become really helpful down the line. To fix that blandness, I made a cube, remeshed it, and sculpted it into the shape of a rock. The clay strips brush was helpful here, but the scrape brush also allowed me to turn the cube into a rock shape. Next, I duplicated it a bunch where the old rock looked bad and the rock looked a lot more realistic. And now with our rocks done, we need some grass. I noticed in my reference that the mossy parts didn't really look like grass, so I couldn't use particle systems. But the solution was actually pretty simple, and it showed me something core to being really good at 3D. First, I made a plane over where I wanted the grass to be, and I scaled it so that it was in the general shape. Next, I subdivided it a few times and added the shrink wrap modifier. What this does is wrap it around the target object. Next, I added a subdivision modifier to smooth it out and another shrink wrap modifier. Then I applied the subdivision and added a solidify modifier as well as a final subdivision at the end. I'm sorry if that was confusing, but you should end up with something like this. All you need to do now is find a moss texture and stick it on the object like you did with the rock. And next, remember how earlier I said those rocks would be helpful later? If you repeat this process with the grass, but for a rock, you can just select both and duplicate them as many times as you want, creating little clusters of moss wherever you want, instead of having to model each one by hand. And now for the final part of the landscape, the grass. This is also one of the most satisfying to make, and after this all we have left are the towers. If you've made it this far, I'm proud of you. But now I downloaded these grass models, and you can find some of your own on Polyhaven. To add them to the scene, I made a particle system on the rocky part and added the grass to its own collection and chose collection under the render tab here. But because I didn't want to have it show everywhere, I went to the weight paint mode at the top, and once my object turned blue, I started drawing where I wanted the grass to go. When you do that, Blender creates what's called a vertex group, which is just where it designates the vertices you paint to be part of a group that you can kind of just do things with. For example, in the Particles tab, you can scroll down to Vertex Groups and hit Group 1 or whatever it's called. Now the grass should appear where you painted, and now you have your grass. If you want, you can add the grass to the ground or just use a grass texture on the new material if your computer is a little bit slower. And now the part you've been waiting for, the towers. Now that we've done all the heavy lifting, we can get to the best part. Creating the tower is mostly up to you. Everything I did was pretty simple, just a cube that I made some loop cuts and extrusions on. Two things I found really helpful here were the Extrude Faces Along Normals tool, which you can access by pressing Alt-E, and the Alt-S shortcut, which scales your faces not just in one direction, but along their outwards and inwards directions, which are called their normals. The wall in the middle was even simpler, just another cube with some loop cut decorations. But once you've done that, you've arrived at the final part of the project, the materials for the towers. And like it was before, this part is pretty easy. Repeat the process you used for the rocks and moss, using the Smart UV Project again to unwrap the UVs, and you're pretty much done. But there is one more thing that you could do to make everything pop. And what is it? If you can tell in this side-by-side comparison, one of these towers has some moss growing on it, and the other is just a flat brick texture. And with these rocks, one is just a flat rock texture, and one also has some moss growing on it. And because it's a separate technique, and because this video would be too long if I explained, go watch this video next to see how.